Well, welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris. He may be the most famous apologist in the 20th century, but he didn't start out that way. He began his intellectual journey as an atheist who didn't believe God existed and was angry with him for not existing. So how did C.S. Lewis become C.S. Lewis? What happened in this young academic's heart and mind 90 years ago that turned him into one of the greatest winners of hearts and minds for Christ in living memory? Well, that's the story of a recent film starring my guest today on Upstream. Max McLean joins me in person at the 2022 Wilberforce Weekend in Orlando, Florida, to talk again about his starring role in the recent biopic, The Most Reluctant Convert, directed by Norman Stone. This movie is an adaptation of Max's touring stage production by the same name and based on C.S. Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy. Attendees this weekend will be enjoying a special screening of the film, so be sure to see that. And we're reflecting together on the impact and example of C.S. Lewis's redeemed life. Max McLean, of course, plays C.S. Lewis, along with a couple of younger actors, in this rich and faithful film. And he brings to the role, I think, a unique, imaginative connection to Lewis's own experiences as a human being. Today, I want to delve deeper into what made Lewis Lewis and what we can learn from setting aside his fiction for a moment, however beloved it may be, and hearing his remarkable real life story. Max McLean, of course, is an award-winning actor and founder and artistic director of the New York-based Fellowship for the Performing Arts. He's adapted and produced numerous plays, including two based on Screwtape Letters and The Great Divorce, two of Lewis's other best-known works. You may also know him as the voice of the audio Bible in several different versions, which you should listen to because it's great for the soul. Max McLean, welcome to Upstream.
Thank you, Shane.
Well, last time you were on Upstream, we talked about your discovery of C.S. Lewis personally, but I don't think we ever talked about how you began to see your acting as a ministry and even as a kind of apologetic tool. How did that happen for you?
Well, I didn't grow up in the church. I got into acting in college. I didn't do any acting in high school. I started acting actually to get over my sociophobia, fear of being in front of people like I am now. So I went to the weird part of campus and took an oral interpretation class, and that's where the bug bit. And that was, I think I was 22 years old, and then a year later, I found Jesus, or Jesus found me. And so I always thought God has worked providentially in my life. First of all, I had a desire to communicate through theater. You know, theater is using your voice, your body, your mind to illuminate great literature, great ideas, great thoughts. And then a year later, he gave me a really great thought to communicate. So that was the beginning of theater for me.
Was C.S. Lewis part of how you came to Christ, or was that afterwards?
Well, it came a little afterwards. To me, it was strictly the Bible. I read John's Gospel in one sitting. I thought Jesus was going to come out of the pages. It was. I tried to read the scriptures before, but for some reason, my heart was ready, and it was overwhelming. Jesus was a hero. I didn't see him as meek and mild, you know, and there's these kind of caricatures of Jesus, and I'm hearing it a lot more now. People are talking about praying to the baby Jesus, and I feel like, yeah, you could pray to him because he may not do anything, but the real Jesus will. So I mean, there's that real sense of a super hero in which all other heroes are based. I think. And the gospel story, to borrow from Jordan Peterson, says the worst possible thing happening to the best possible person. And that's kind of what I thought, because I was just overwhelmed by the story of the injustice of it. And I found the resurrection in John's gospel was just so overwhelming. And I knew I was changed. I mean, my heart was completely different. My eyes were opened. It was a profound conversion experience for me. And Lewis came right after.
And so your conversion experience is not exactly, analogous to Lewis's. So when you are inhabiting this role, you're stepping into the shoes of someone who came to faith through a different means than you. How did that affect your
Yeah, well, when I tell the long version of my conversion story, the beginning of it started about 4 years earlier, and where somebody shared the gospel with me in a way that was horrifying. Not the way he shared it, but the way I received it. Because I didn't want to have anything to do with it. It was, I at that point, I actually knew it was true, but I just resisted it with all I had. I said, I don't want this, I don't want this. I ran, and I did. So that part of it really is analogous to the most reluctant convert, yeah.
So you were also a reluctant convert.
Yeah, so the shorter version is you just tell the ending of it, which is kind of what Lewis says, I gave in.
Do you recall your first encounter with C.S. Lewis? What did you think of him when you first read
Well,
it?
my first encounter, the first memorable encounter, somebody had actually given me Surprise by Joy shortly after my conversion, because it's a conversion story. So I read it from beginning to end. I don't think I understood a word of it. It went by me like a freight train. And so the person says, well, try this. So this person gave me a copy of Screw Tape Letters. And from the very first scene, and you might remember the first scene, it's Screw Tape is recounting his successes. And he talks about a man in the British Museum. Remember this? And all, he's reading something in the British Museum. And Screw Tape says, I've seen 20 years' work just kind of fly up in smoke, right? And so he had to really move quickly. And so he leaned in his ear and says, isn't it just about time for lunch? And I remember, whoa, that was such a revelation, because it really made me understand spiritual warfare in a much different way than I would have otherwise. And it's interesting in that scene too, because I think he ends it, or at least in our adaptation of it, which we borrow from other scenes, but when he finishes recounting the story about how this man in the British Museum is now safe in our Father's house, which is really brutal, because he never went back. Screw Tape showed him a newspaper, number 73 bus passing by, and he's talking about how we're just so easily distracted, and the finishing line was, it's funny how these humans picture us as putting things into their minds. Our best work is done by keeping things out. And that's why, by the way, he doesn't want any of you here at the Wilberforce conference.
Well, so in so many ways, the Screw Tape Letters is an open door on that kind of strategy that the forces of darkness could have, that so much of it is not like the caricatures that we have of the devil, of whispering in our ear, putting things into our minds. And of course, this is part of Lewis's great talent, is he helps us see things in a new light for the first time.
Oh, if you look at our culture, you see Screw Tape everywhere. You're very aware of how gaslit we are. And so that's one of the reasons I'm really, really, really pleased to be here.
So when I first, read all of these things, and as I think back on my experience with C.S. Lewis's work, none of it immediately struck me as ripe for stage production. Where did that idea come from for you?
Yeah, that's true. The instrumental cause was we were doing a theatrical production of Genesis, which was really quite a good production, and this theater professor at Drew University saw it, and he wrote me an email later, and he happened to be a Christian, and not too many theater professors that are Christian. I mean, you can kind of count them in one hand, but no, actually that's growing. But he wrote, he says, I really like what you do. I like why you do it, et cetera. He says, I think you'd make a really good Screw Tape. And I didn't know if that was a compliment or not.
You just exude evil. Now, Andy Serkis, yes. I'm not sure about you.
So, but anyway, so I thought about it, and I was intrigued because of the initial impact of the story. But I saw it as, I didn't see it like you just said, I didn't see it as theatrical literature. I saw it as kind of a reverse devotional. But he had an idea how to do it. And I said, well, if we can get the rights from C.S. Lewis Estate, we'll have a go. And that was in the early 2000s. That was about 20 years ago. And so we spent a lot of time developing it. We had a lot of misses in terms of developing it. But once we figured out the code, I think it's one of the most important things we've ever done.
So most of us in this room fell in love with C.S. Lewis through his stories, right? He writes stories about other people. Narnia is probably the first example in all of our minds. Screwtape is high on the list as well. Why is the story of Lewis's own life and conversion worth telling? And why is it, as you say in the kind of subtitle, an untold story?
Yeah. Well, I had nothing to do with that, and I probably wouldn't have chosen it, but it was untold on film. I think it's been told, he told it, but it's not very well known. Shadowlands was an untold story about his wife, Joy Davidovich. That was totally unknown, and Norman Stone, who actually made that a very key part of Lewis lore. But in terms of theatrical literature and going back to his conversion, the experience I had with Screwtape Letters, the experience I had with Great Divorce, in both cases, they are they're both about spiritual warfare, fictional retellings of aspects of his own conversion. In Screwtape, he's the Screwtape is written, because he said he never wrote anything more easily, but it wasn't very enjoyable because he had to dig into his own life to talk about. It was actually a confessional. He was the model for the patient in the story. And then in The Great Divorce, it's similar. It's the opposite side of the coin, in the sense of Screwtape is about spiritual warfare from the devil's point of view, how he tempts us away from God, whereas The Great Divorce is about spiritual warfare from the heavenly point of view, how we resist the Holy Spirit. And so both of them, he's really retelling his story. So that prompted me to go back to Surprised by Joy and to see it through that lens.
This, on the surface, looks like an adaptation of Surprised by Joy. And if you have read Surprised by Joy, you'll recognize so much of the dialogue in this as directly verbatim from Lewis. But you've drawn from more than just his autobiography. You've kind of gone through the whole Lewis canon and pulled out a piece here, a piece there, things that need to be acknowledged as part of his own spiritual journey, because like you said, they are autobiographical. How did you make that kind of choice?
Yeah, well, I was driven by the conversion. There was the arc of his conversion, and then there were certain things that I said, oh, I remember reading that here. And one of the things, if you spend a lot of time in Lewis's canon, he repeats himself constantly. And not in a bad sense. It's just that he has different ways and you see it differently. And I've actually found it to be very, very helpful. So I used a lot of, I'm just thinking of Most Reluctant Convert. I read a lot of biographies. I probably read about a dozen. Three that I like to mention. Devin Brown's A Life Observed, because it really kind of helps shape the arc of the story. The Narnian by Alan Jacobs, because that helped me understand the personality of Lewis. And then Armand Nicolai's The Question of God, the back and forth, because I think one of the great things about Lewis as an apologist is his conversion experience. He recognized what people are reacting against, and he argues towards that, or he writes towards that, not necessarily argument. And so that was very, very helpful in drawing it. Weight of Glory was a big part, particularly of the end. So I'm just trying to think of some other. Problem of Pain was the opening scene. When I was an atheist, this is how I thought.
In the museum with the dinosaur skeleton and everything. Yeah.
That's and the key was I didn't want to straw man his atheism. I wanted to steel man it. Just get his. Because you wanted to see how far he had to come. To me, one of the best lines that reflect that is, he lost his mother to cancer. He had a terrible relationship with his father. He experienced the butchery of World War I in the trenches. And so he came to the conclusion, if this is, all you got, then either there's no God behind the universe, a God indifferent to good and evil, or worse, an evil God. And when he went back to Oxford, he noticed that at his college, they read the minutes of his. He got back to Oxford in 1919, and they read the minutes from their last meeting, which was in 1914, 5 years. And just read the minutes, and I haven't read the minutes, so I don't exactly know what he's referencing, but he said, nothing made me realize more thoroughly the absolute waste of those years. I mean, a generation was lost. And somebody asked him at that time, he says, were you much frightened in France? All the time, he said, but I never sank so low as to pray. I go, whoa.
That's a rock-ribbed atheism at that point. I remember his strongest steel man presentation of his atheism. I think it's at the beginning of Problem of Pain. And it's where he just describes this utterly indifferent universe, and the complete futility of everything winding down at the end. And he's like, that's what I would have said at this point in my life. But I'm not there anymore, and I'm here writing this book. And this is like early, I guess, 1940?
1940, yeah. And that, of course, that book has really launched his career. That's the book that made him, the BBC discovered him through that book. It had 6 printings in his first year. I mean, astonishing for him because, he wrote Allegory of Love, and, it was an academic book that was highly praised but didn't sell well. Pilgrim's Regress, I think, sold 600 copies. I think Out of the Silent Planet probably did a little bit better. But this, 6 printings in his first year. And the theme of the book was that God whispers in our pleasures, speaks to our conscience, but shouts in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. That's what got everybody's attention. Then he says that not everyone approved. He says one of his colleagues complained that the problem of pain is quite bad enough without Jack Lewis making it worse.
This, you're able to quote Lewis with such fluidity and such, speed. How did you come to the decision to read a lot of this stuff verbatim as a play? Because when you read Lewis off the page, he's pretty dense. There's a lot there. You have to pause a lot and take breaths if you're going to keep going with this on stage. What was the point where you said, I'm not going to rewrite this. I'm actually going to use a lot of his own words?
Yeah, well, I think that's the strength. That was one of the smartest things I did was trust Lewis. He said something about that I really took to heart. He said that people enjoy following a sustained argument. Now, that wasn't exactly what he said, but in terms of a sustained set of ideas that are logically presented. People enjoy following that because, he said, they don't do it very often. And I thought, that's interesting. So I kind of really just kind of leaned into that, trusting that. I did thin it out. One of the things I do think Lewis, and it was sort of the writing of that time too. It was overwritten, so I could edit it. So instead of a 60-word sentence, I could use his words in 30 words, and get to the point. Stay with the verb, because the verbs sort of stay in your head. Not really. He does a lot of examples. I would use one example where he might use 3. Just find the best one and then keep it moving forward. So those were some of the choices, but they were still all his. And so it was the right choice. I mean, and people have told me, and I think this is right, that they enjoy the film better the second time. Because the first time they're trying to just figure out all the things that's happened. Now they know what's going to happen, so they can now listen. I also think the film really works well just if some films are better in the theater. I think this film's better at home. where you can just sit and enjoy it very intimately. It's much more of an intimate film.
Well, I have to confess that I watched it at home, and I enjoyed that precisely because I could pause the TV and think about what I just heard a little more, because these are beloved lines. These are things I've read before, but even the density of what he's saying there, the full gravity of what he's saying, and then the expressions that you're using to draw that out, to communicate it to us in a way that that illustrates all the subtexts that Lewis has going on, was just extremely rich. It's like drinking from a fire hose, as John said last night. And one theme that I caught in Lewis's own words that I did not catch reading it. So you're either inserting this or you have come to a masterful realization of what Lewis was really saying, right?
I think it's the latter.
You think?
Well, let's see.
It was that during much of Surprised by Joy, at any rate, Lewis is, he has a sardonic attitude toward himself. He is making fun of himself in some ways.
Yeah, I think that's part of his charm. He's so self-deprecating, and I find it the humor in the pieces, I think, is earned, and I don't know if I told you this because we've interviewed once before, but the way I wrote the script was, and this is actually a fairly common, I don't know how common it is, but I know other people do it, is you take this book, and I actually transcribed it, thinking his thoughts after him, so that I could follow his choices. And that really helped me to really dig deeply into, just the way he frames a sentence, because I followed. Now, why did he do that? And I did that through that whole book. And that really was, I think, the key to writing the script. Because then it became a matter of just chiseling. You've got all this clay, just chisel it out until you get the story.
Right. I know that stage production is a very different thing. Acting on a stage is a very different thing from acting in front of a camera. And I know that a lot of actors for the stage are very particular about that. There's even kind of a, dare we say, a snobbery about acting in front of a camera. How did you feel about making the transition? Right?
Yeah, it's the interesting thing is theater acting is definitely an actor's medium. Film acting is a director's medium. Kind of sometimes an actor is sort of a potted plant. He's kind of the least important person in the room. But of course, the focus is all on him. Everything's about framing the shot, getting this cutaway, that cutaway. There's nothing done in order. Like we did when we did the film, I Gave In, The Most Reluctant Convert in All England. We did that the second day of shooting. There was no continuity. Right? So if I didn't have the continuity from the stage play, I don't know how anybody else could have done that. But that was, because the director gets all the pieces, and that's not the purpose of that. Of course, is that when we had Magdalen College, Oxford, for 3 days. These are the 3 days we had it. So we had to do all the shots at Magdalen College in those 3 days, just like we had to do all the shots at the Kilns in those 2 days. So that's what happened, and then. So what you do is you take this script, you cut it up into 100 pieces, and then you do them out of order, and then somebody else pieces it back together and brings it. But the difference is the stage play, one actor, one set, 90 minutes, 75 minutes. The film, we had 18 different locations. 15 actors. We had 3 actors playing Lewis. We had Barfield, Tolkien, Mom and Dad, Warney, all the actors. We had 190 extras, 240 costumes. So it's a huge production, and the ability of somebody like Norman Stone to have all of that in his head, and he sees it all in pictures, and just. He runs such a fabulous set. He's very charming, very disciplined, but very charming. And we did we would do, most films you might do 2 or 3 pages in a day. We did 9, 10 pages a day. It was really remarkable. I was impressed. At my old age, I think theater is definitely a young person's sport. Film is definitely, that's for me.
You had to take a break, go have a sandwich.
All you have to, when I just did a brand new show in Phoenix, and we've been working so hard on it, and it was just 90 minutes straight through and done. On the stage, you say a couple of lines, cut. That was easy. The problem is you just have to do that same 3 or 4 lines, from this angle, from that angle, over there, and then he pieces it all together, gets what he needs.
So we've talked a lot about your philosophy behind this whole thing, your introduction to Lewis, why we love C.S. Lewis, and why he's uniquely difficult to adapt to the stage and to film. But for those who may be listening who just don't know the story that we're talking about, obviously, number one is go see the film, right? But number two, could you give us kind of a summary of what C.S. Lewis's journey is? What's the story that this movie tells?
Yeah, well, it's an origin story of how, who is perhaps the most influential Christian of the 20th century, who went from being a vigorous debunker of Christianity. I mean, at the level of somebody like Christopher Hitchens, and he had those type of gifts. He had those same rhetorical gifts, and how over a long period of time, he went from that to first becoming the most reluctant convert in all England, and then becoming the most influential Christian writer of the 20th century. So that's the arc of the story that we're telling. The pieces of it, I mentioned a couple earlier, lost his mother to cancer at 9, had terrible relation with his father, got worse after his mother died. The trenches in First World War, he says it was the hell where youth and laughter go. Seeing horribly smashed men still moving about like crushed beetles. I mean, a horrible image. And he came to the conclusion that either there's no God behind the universe, God indifferent to good and evil, or actually God is evil. Is a kind of a sadism to it. That was, his position. And then through the influence of people like Owen Barfield, Hugo Dyson, J.R. Tolkien, and others who kept challenging him. I mean, the big challenge was, see if I can get this right, is that his argument against God was that the universe was so cruel and unjust. But where did he get this notion of cruel and unjust? That was big, because he calls a line crooked because he has some idea of a straight line. What was he comparing the universe with when he called it cruel and unjust? And what's interesting about that, the reason problem of pain became so popular, particularly during World War II, was that he made this statement as a result of what I just said. He said, Christianity doesn't solve the problem of pain, problem of evil, problem of suffering. It actually creates it. Because pain and suffering would not be a problem unless you had an expectation that ultimate reality is righteous and good. Then you have a reason to complain. Because otherwise the alternative is the everyday experiences of evil and suffering, of injustice and wickedness, of right and wrong, is just the arbitrary result of biochemistry and physics. I mean, it's just the card that you lost your daughter in a car wreck. Gosh, that's too bad. That's just the card you were dealt. That's so unsatisfying. Whereas if you know that there's a God who's righteous and good, then you may feel the pain and you may be bitterly angry about it, as Job was, but you know that there's something behind it.
Right. And the conversations that you depict, where with Dyson, with Barfield, with Tolkien, who confronted him on this stuff, really showcase how hard Lewis struggled against the inevitable conclusions toward which they were drawing him. I think my favorite was, Addison's Walk is everyone's favorite, right? But that one was kind of eclipsed in this movie for me by the conversation he has with Barfield, is that right? In his dorm room at Oxford, right? Where he's, or Magdalen College at this point, right? Which is a college of Oxford. Shows how many times I've been there. where he essentially gives him the, what's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism, where he's like, if your brain is merely an evolved mechanism of material parts that are crashing into each other, then the conclusions that you reached, the reasoning process that led you to conclude that that is so, is untrustworthy. So it destroys itself, it defeats itself. And
well, Lewis said that argument, he must have been as blind as a bat not to have seen it, and that actually moved him immediately to a sort of a pantheistic perspective that, obviously there's some creator God is the least objectionable theory for the origin of the universe. But what was interesting, he actually put a pause on that, because with that, he said that God, it's not going to do anything. It's up there. It's never going to come here and make a nuisance of itself, which is exactly what happened. And so he was always kind of hedging his bets. And then, of course, he read George MacDonald's Fantastes. G.K. Chesterton really rocked his world. He meets J.R. Tolkien. He says there's Christians everywhere, and he's kind of freaked out by it. He says all his books were turning against him.
There's this line, I think you repeated in the movie, where he says that like George Bernard Shaw, the atheists he read were he enjoyed them, but they were tinny. There was a thin quality to them. Whereas when he read these Christians, George MacDonald, there's a richness there. And he even says George MacDonald baptized his imagination.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you mentioned that. He says that they were thin, tinny, entertaining, but hardly more. He says they didn't have the roughness and density of life of the religious authors, which was, and he hated that, And then what was also very interesting in the story is, his conversion experience. I gave in. He makes it very clear, because it looks so much like a Christian conversion. He makes it very clear it wasn't a Christian conversion. It was a theistic conversion. Now, I find that interesting because, you and I might think of a theistic conversion kind of lame a little bit, but not in his mind. He saw it completely differently. In his mind, it would have been like Moses in the burning bush. It would have been like, I am that I am. He was confronted with the God on top of Mount Sinai. The righteous God, the giver of the law. And he said that, for a time, my religion was like that of the Jews, and I think that's often overlooked in Lewis's, in Lewis's evolution to Christianity. In fact, he said he had no belief in the incarnation. He said, the God to whom I surrendered was not human. He simply couldn't understand how the life and death of someone else, whoever he was 2,000 years ago, could help us here and now. And that's where that Addison's Walk talk was very, very important.
This idea of a theistic conversion, and that was where he actually says the line that became the title of the movie, I was the most reluctant convert in all of England. This theistic conversion idea is interesting and worth revisiting today because of a number of figures in our time. When you're sitting over there, we were talking about some of the Christianized atheists of our time. And one of them who comes to mind, who seems to be somewhat vulnerable to that, is Jordan Peterson. And my listeners to the podcast know I like him. I've read him.
I do too. I read a lot of his and listen to him
but
regularly.
He says something.
And I think it's because of the point of view. He sees what we know from a different point of view, and that helps us.
There's something he says to the effect of, and I think it was maybe during his discussion with Jonathan Pageau on his podcast it's called Symbolic World. And he says something to the effect of, if I were to accept the Christian, or not the Christian God, but if I were to accept the existence of God, then that would be incalculable, because it would mean that there are moral duties and there are realities that I have to dedicate my entire life to. And so I'm not sure that I'm willing to say the words, I believe in God, in the way you're saying, and because I know I'd have to take it so seriously afterwards that it would be deadly earnest, the most deadly earnest thing in the world. And in some ways, that's refreshing.
Yeah, and that was Lewis's journey, right there. Yeah, And I think that's one of the reasons why I think he attracts, we're a little off subject here, but it's fine. He attracts so many young men because I think we instinctively know that. It's Romans 1. We know it instinctively. We suppress it. And I think somebody like Jordan Peterson, particularly with his credentials, allows us to allow somebody that's not in the church, I suppose, because that has connotations that people have to overcome, but they can explore it with Jordan Peterson. Unfortunately, Jordan can't take them very far, but he can take them to the fence, and I think there's an opportunity for people like us.
So Jordan Peterson needs his own Tolkien to take him on. The Addison's Walk talk about myth became fact.
Yeah, that's true. And the interesting thing about the Tolkien conversation, is that he reached out to him. He said that Tolkien explained to him that throughout the pagan religions, there's this vague notion of a god who's killed, broken, come to life again. Balder, Osiris, Dionysus, all the myths. And these myths were ones Lewis loved. Read, he could really resonate with them and love the story because they were meaningful to him. His problem with Christianity was, as he experienced it, and I think it's a similar problem that's happening in our day, is it was dry. It didn't capture the imagination. It was like, it was so prescriptive. So, it felt like a school book. And so he just couldn't, it had these stained glass, he called it these stained glass window associations. So he couldn't get past that, right? It couldn't get, his imagination couldn't go there. But that's where the Tolkien argument did. And then what Tolkien did further, which is what made Lewis a tremendous Bible student and then later a Bible expositor in his own way, was that among these Jews who he already believed that side of the story, he was a monotheist. Among these Jews, the thing really happened. The myth did become fact. And I think the most important, that there came a man who claimed to be the son of that who is the giver of the moral law and the awful presence atop Sinai. Now, to a first century Jew to make that claim is so shocking. I mean, we just take it way too lightly. We can't get in the head of somebody who believed in Yahweh, that this guy says, oh, that's my dad. And it's so shocking, we just take it too lightly. This man was a raving lunatic. And I think one of the great things about Lewis that's a little bit underplayed these days is I don't think there's anyone who is better at expressing in vivid terms the divinity of Christ. I think he's so good at that in terms of getting a pagan person to really look at the uniqueness of Jesus in a brand new way. He does that, I think, better than anyone else.
And that's, the potential for something like this, even a fresh form of presenting his autobiography that can reach people who wouldn't otherwise have picked up his autobiography. I think back on G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, which I just read. Listeners to the podcast will know I've been on a big Chesterton kick lately. And one of the things he says, in fact, he kind of opens with this, is this description of a strange animal, right? And I won't quote it here, but it's this, he goes through all these details about this bizarre creature with a head that's too small for its body, sticking out on a neck like a gargoyle on a gutter spout, and one weird row of hair on the back of its neck, and clubs for feet. And he's like, what kind of strange dragon am I describing that's coming out of the primeval forest? And he's like, well, it's a horse, guys. And it sounds very strange when I describe what a horse literally looks like, but we've all seen a horse, and we know what a horse looks like. And so we have allowed the mundanity of that, the commonplace nature of that sight to gauze our eyes over, so we no longer see a horse for what it really is. And he wanted to present the history of the world and Christianity as if for the first time. And it seems like a presentation like this of Lewis's story can show people what he saw as if for the first time, like you said.
I really appreciate that. You've actually encouraged me to go back and read Everlasting Man. It's a really, really good picture. I mean, one of the things that I'm really excited about is the kinds of, out of nowhere people that I get letters from. I had a letter from Norman Lear, telling me how much he loved the movie. I was really, that came out of nowhere. You don't get letters from Norman Lear. I've never got one before. Somebody by the name of Tim Ferriss, who has supposedly the #1 business podcast in the world, he just tweets out that this is what he watched this weekend, and he wants everybody else to watch it. And he said, "I'm not religious, but this was really was important." I said, "That sort of stuff is those are really, really satisfying, in a big way. About what my job was to, he called me to do this, and he gave me the joy to do it. I would have done it if nobody saw it, but the fact that he's using it is so exciting."
Max, what have you learned about C.S. Lewis from doing this?
He's really smart. I mean, this just in. He read everything. He was so learned, from the Greeks to the moderns, right? Just and he had this steel trap mind that could remember every nook and cranny of what he read. It was just photographic. And then, of course, he had this magnificent ability to translate all of that into magnificent prose and speech, right? I mean, I think if he's not the greatest writer of the last couple of centuries, I mean, I think he's the greatest writer since Shakespeare. But he did all of it, under the headship of Jesus. And that just, that's really encouraging, to use all that wisdom and learning and put it at the feet of the cross and have God use it. That just so, I mean, Walter Hooper called him the most thoroughly converted man he'd ever met.
There's a tough question that arises when you mention C.S. Lewis in certain heady theological circles, especially in the Reformed tradition, which is my own. Okay, so you'll know what I'm talking about. There's a certain reaction to Lewis as like, C.S. Lewis, Narnia, he's the kiddie pool, right? You don't really wade deep with Lewis. You just you get introduced, and then you get into the real theologians. And Lewis wasn't a theologian. He would be the first to tell you that. But I had this friend. I still have this friend. He just moved far away, and he said he had that exact same attitude, and he actually wrote an essay about this. And he said that I believed I had gotten the measure of Lewis, and then I actually began to read some of his nonfiction, and I think it was The Abolition of Man that really corrected him and helped him realize what a deep thinker Lewis was on contemporary issues. And he said by the time he got through with, I think it might have been The Great Divorce, he said, I was ready to sit at the feet of the master. And that's what I want to ask you about. What would you say to someone who says that Lewis is overrated? Because he gets so much exposure. Is he still worth really discovering for the first time? I mean, and why?
Yes.
You really surprised me with that answer, yeah.
It's funny you ask that question because here we are in Orlando, Florida, right? And I got so much of my theological education from Dr. R.C. Sproul, right? Who probably had many in his camp, although he was respectful, but obviously disagreed on certain points with Lewis. I think that if you limit yourself to his children's literature, you may, reasonably come to that conclusion. But his ability to write children's literature that is effective for children was because of how learned he was and knew what to keep in and what to pull out. I remember having an experience that a lot of people would love to be able to do, and only a few can. And like him, when I was just starting my theatrical career, I'd take odd jobs doing creative dramatics with young kids, and I remember one of the things I did, 5, 6, 7-year-old kids, I would read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and they listened with such intensity. And when we got to the stone table, they were sitting, right, and they all stood up. They just involuntarily, their bodies were shaking, and I go, who can do that? Because he knew how to get to the core, with the simplicity, because it came from such a rich source. And then, of course, when you do read the nonfiction such as Abolition of Man, Weight of Glory, his essays in God in the Dock, Present Concerns, even Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity is not an easy read. It's not, but it's worth, and quite frankly, I would encourage people to listen to the audiobook. It's a very good audiobook. And there's something about hearing Lewis that allows the words to penetrate a little bit more. I don't think too many people who are serious about learning would come to that conclusion.
So what's next?
I kind of spilled the beans a little bit, and actually tonight I'm going to just share a little scene from a new piece. When Lewis was converted in 1931, it wasn't obvious he was going to become the person he became, right? The most influential Christian writer of the 20th century and beyond. I mean, he sells more books this year than he did last year, and he'll sell more next year than he did this year. His embers are still blazing. Most dead writers, their embers are dead.
Well, he had some friends who are still going pretty strong as well.
That's true. Good point. What were we talking about? Oh, what's next? What's next? Yes, right. Yeah.
About what's next? Yeah.
So what's next is to see how to kind of shape his thoughts. That how he became how he matured, what were the things that opened it up? Like, for instance, why did the BBC give him a national platform? To express Christianity. They didn't want a clergyman or another religious jaw. They wanted a fresh new voice, whatever that was. Lewis thought. How did he heard Hitler's Reichstag speech, his last appeal to the British people. Just before he did the Blitz, Lewis heard that speech, like everybody else in Britain. It was translated over the BBC, and 2 days later he came up with Screw Tape. Right. That was kind of interesting, and how he was as an evangelist, an apologist. He was so effective. What was his? He said something really interesting. He says he was reflecting on why the broadcast talks that became Mere Christianity became so galvanizing. He said the appeal of these talks, I think, was that they came from a position of belief. And he goes on to say, a believed idea feels different than an idea that's not believed. So there's something about the conviction that he had on radio, that people could hear it, so that folks would be in a pub and say, shut up, I want to listen to this bloke, And, he says, I believe there is but one God and that Jesus Christ is his only son. I believe in prayer, in judgment, in the second coming, in heaven and in hell. And he goes on to say that, when bombs destroy our homes, talk of Armageddon no longer seems fanciful, as in this, quoting Shakespeare, as in this weak piping time of peace. Lewis was a man for his time, but I think any time we get out of our complacency, we want to hear voices like this.
So you didn't tell us what's next.
That's it.
Oh.
All that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's called Further Up, Further In. That's the name of it.
So this is a movie?
No, this is a play. It may become a movie. We are doing, we have engaged Norman Stone to work with us to develop 2 more C.S. Lewis films. The first film stops at 1931 at his conversion, so there's 31 to 63. He died in November 22nd, 1963, the same day Kennedy was assassinated. So we wanted, that's only, it's only 32 years, 32 years that after his conversion. how much he produced in those 32 years. So we want to tell the rest of that story over the course of 2 more films, at least two more plays.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. My guest has been Max McLean, founder and artistic director of the Fellowship of the Performing Arts, and the star of a new movie called The Most Reluctant Convert, the untold story of C.S. Lewis. Max, thanks for joining me on Upstream again. This was a pleasure.